If you're cruising down the road and you've got a noticeable lope in your front end, there are a few things that you can start to look at to troubleshoot. The first one you'll probably go to is the tire and the wheel. Are they balanced? Then you can start looking at other components. Are there any damage to your forks, either externally or internally? Because there are a lot of components within those forks that can go bad, especially if you're dealing with an older bike or a bike that's been abused. You may also have a slightly bent axle. On this bike, I've got bearings that need to be replaced. I knew this when I took this in to have the front end balanced. They told me that they were going bad and that I should put that on my list of to-dos. So today we're going to get those done. On the left side of the bike, a couple of things that we have to deal with on this particular model are the speedometer cable, which you can either disconnect down here at the hub or you can disconnect at the speedometer. I think I'm going to disconnect mine at the speedometer. The other thing I want to do before I loosen the pinch bolts on the right hand side is I want to loosen the axle nut. On the right side of the bike, we're just going to loosen this pinch bolt here. It may not be necessary for you to take it out, but you certainly can, either way. Now with that loose, I can remove the axle nut on the other side and then just straighten this wheel out. Pull that axle and we should be good. If you have to persuade the axle out, try to use a rubber mallet so that you don't damage the threads on your axle. And of course, always keep track of how things start coming apart. You're going to have an axle, you're going to have some spacers in here. On the other side, we're going to have the speedometer housing. And all of that's going to want to fall out. I'm going to lay things out as I take this apart, not only on side, but also on orientation of where these things are going to go back into place. To get to the right side bearings, we've got to remove this cap. In here you're going to have a dust seal that sits on the outside of the actual bearing, which is down in here. Now on the left side, or the brake side, we've got to get this rotor off, so we need to loosen and remove those 4 bolts. And then the rotor. This side actually has a split ring in here that needs to come out. Now that the spring clip is out on this side, I can remove this fitting here, which I believe initiates the speedometer. Now I can see the bearing here, there are no more seals, so this side is ready to remove. On the right side we need to remove this seal, and for this job what I've found that probably the best tool to have is just a screwdriver that you've smoothed out and you've bent, and you can hook it right underneath there. Really not much to it. So now we got to get this snap ring out of the way. So if you look at this closely, this snap ring was bent while I was trying to remove that. I'm hoping that this size is pretty standard and I can pick that up at just one of my local automotive shops. Otherwise, I'm going to have to get a new one of those before I can put this back together. But that won't prevent me from moving further on these bearings. When I first looked at these hubs and was trying to figure out how to get these bearings out, I thought that I could force the opposite bearing out by driving down on this upper bearing here. There's a tube that runs in between them, and the energy from hitting this bearing would translate over into that other bearing and drive it out. I realized after working on that for a little while that that was not going to work. To get these bearings out, it turns out I need a bearing puller, and this is what I've got from the auto parts store. Luckily, they have a tool rental system, which is great, and I didn't have to purchase this. Basically, the way this is going to work is these two tabs will slide down in this inner race, and then as I twist on this portion, it expands these. I'll have a slide hammer that hooks into here, creates some force, and hopefully those bearings will pop right out. Let's give it a try. So I'm not gonna lie, that sucked. And my original idea of driving on one bearing to push the other one out would never have worked, especially on this side, because this actually necks down towards the center of the hub. But now that I've got that bearing out and that center tube, I could actually use a pipe to force the one on the other side out now that I've got all of this clearance here. But I think I'll just go ahead and use that puller on the other side, get it out, and then we'll be ready to clean this hub up, start putting things back together. I've got the bearings and the inner tube or collar out. And I just wanted to show you another option that you might be able to try before you have to resort to finding a puller. This tube on the inside is not a super tight fit, meaning inside of that hub, this will slide side to side. What that allows you to do is if you've got a punch in that first bearing that you're trying to remove, you can slide this punch down and push this tube off to the side. If I raise that up, that gives you access to a striking surface on this inner race. If you can drive that bearing out using that technique, then you can remove this tube from the other side. You can directly strike that bearing and pop it out as well. So if we look at these new bearings, the sizes of these, the inside diameter for the axle is roughly 14.92 millimeters. The outside is roughly 42 millimeters, and the thickness is 12.9596 millimeters. If you look at the old bearings, you'll see that these are directional, meaning this is the outside face, and this open surface here goes inside the hub. The new bearings, they all come pre-greased and pre-sealed, and they're not directional. So those can go in either side, either direction. One thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to place these bearings in the freezer. Hopefully that will cause them to shrink just enough to make installation in here easier. A couple of things that I want to have ready to go before I get to the point of dropping the new bearings in is I want to have a way to push the new bearings in, and the old bearings provide a perfect tool for that because we already know that they're the same diameter as the new ones, so we can hit the old bearing to drive the new bearing in at least to where it's flush with the hub. Then we're going to continue to drive it all the way down to this bearing surface right here. To do that, we've got to have some kind of a pipe or a large socket. I wish I had a little bit bigger socket so that it would fit on that outside bearing surface, but this will work. And when I strike this, I want to make sure that I put the pressure evenly and around the outside of this bearing. So once those bearings are cold, we're ready to install. So I've got my hub supported so that when I beat down on that new bearing, driving it in place, the pressure is not on the spokes or the wheel. I've got all the tools I need to do this, so let's go grab one of them bearings from the freezer and hopefully it'll fall right in. These 4 bolts get torqued to 29 foot-pounds. If you're concerned of whether your axle is straight or not, you'll want to get a hold of a dial indicator and either build or purchase a V-block so that you can rest the axle in there. I'm going to put together a video on how I made this one. It's super simple. It's actually adjustable and it's held together by these clamps. All I'm looking for here on the dial indicator is movement to determine whether there's any bend in this axle. I see very little movement in there, so I'm not worried about this axle at all. The manufacturer says you can have up to 1/8,000th of an inch before it's considered bent and it needs to be replaced. There are only a couple of things left to do on this project. One of them is to tighten this clamp bolt or pinch bolt. This gets tightened to 13 foot-pounds. The next thing is to tighten and torque this axle and the axle nut. That goes to 58 pounds. When you turn this, the axle may still spin. On the other side, you probably noticed that there's a hole, and that's so that you can put a screwdriver or a bar in there and hold that in place until you get it torqued. Now, just reconnect your speedometer cable. Give it a little spin. Make sure everything lines up, and sit back and admire your work. Thanks for watching.